you're confused about whether Russia is about to invade Ukraine and kick off a devastating and deadly war, well, welcome to Monday with the world on edge. You've got the U.S. moving its embassy out of Kyiv, and this flip quip from the Ukrainian president stressing people out to the point his office had to walk it back. So, is war imminent? Or is there really, as the White House keeps saying, an open door for diplomacy? We're going to break that down in a minute. Plus, some breaking news from Canada as we were walking into the studio. The Canadian Prime Minister just announcing he'll pull out these rare emergency powers to stop the trucker protests we've been telling you about. What that means for those demonstrators, even as a key bridge reopens today, and this whole thing feels far from over. And also, just into us, the accounting firm for the Trump Organization basically firing the Trump Organization, saying the paperwork it prepared for almost a decade shouldn't be relied on. Why that could be a big deal for the investigation into the former president's company. And Bonnie and Clyde, they are not. The couple, arrested for allegedly trying to launder $4 billion worth of Bitcoin, heads to court, and we've got the wild details about a crime made for prime time. Plus, Meta tossed out its facial recognition program, but could the company still have your data anyway? More on why Texas is now suing over that very question and just how many billions of dollars it could cost the platform. Hey, I'm Hallie. And listen, it's been a confusing couple of hours with the world on edge over what's going down between Ukraine and Russia. It is a cliche to say that tensions are soaring, but here's the thing, they are. Everybody is bracing for the possibility Vladimir Putin will invade and start a war in Europe. Okay, so maybe not the greatest time for the Ukrainian president to drop some apparent sarcasm in his speech to his country, but he did, and succeeded only in freaking out his people that maybe Moscow will invade, maybe this week, maybe on Wednesday specifically. President Zelensky's office had to walk it back, saying this whole Wednesday thing, February 16th, was not official. It's not some big warning. He's just repeating a date that was speculated about in some media reports. But that doesn't mean the tensions have evaporated. They are definitely still there, with the Pentagon's press secretary saying today the U.S. doesn't think Putin has made up his mind either way.
We still don't believe that some final decision has been made. I won't get into a specific date. I don't think that would be smart. I would just tell you that it is entirely possible that he could move with little to no warning.
Tomorrow, the defense secretary heads to Europe to visit some NATO allies, including to Poland, where U.S. troops are headed. But remember, the Pentagon has said no matter what, those troops are staying out of Ukraine, even if Russia invades. But because the Kremlin has moved more troops to the border, even in the last 24 to 48 hours, you've got the State Department moving embassy operations out of Kyiv, further west toward Poland, just in case. So let's bring in now Matt Bradley in eastern Ukraine. Matt, here's the thing. Viewers of this show will know that when you and I have talked in the past, we've talked about how President Zelensky of Ukraine was kind of downplaying the potential for this possible invasion. Then he comes out in a speech, sets a date, basically. That's the way it was seen by the rest of the world. Then his office has to walk it back. What is the deal?
I mean, did he walk it back? I mean, we walked it back. That was the problem, and that was the scramble that we were facing. You know, we read in the transcript, as it was interpreted, that this was February 16th, that he was saying that this was the date, which is something that we had heard in other media reports like a week ago. So we were kind of panicking. I'm not going to lie, Hallie. You know, we were wondering, what does he mean? Turns out, as you said, he was being sarcastic. Sarcasm, these jokes, they're kind of hard to translate, and we were fumbling with that. And we weren't the only network that was doing that. We weren't the only journalists that were doing that. But then you got to go kind of wonder about the president of Ukraine. Like, do you have to joke about a war? But that was a real trouble for us. And, you know, so I don't think they were really walking it back. I think we were the ones doing that.
Okay, fine, Matt. Fair point. The bottom line, though, is that Zelensky said something when he knows the world is watching on an international stage at a moment when it feels different, as you well know, having been there, right? Based on the warnings that we've heard from the United States National Security Advisor, from top U.S. officials, the intelligence that has been coming out. At a time when semantics matter, when every word matters, you know, we could not call it a walk back, but that's essentially what his office has to do, was issue an international clarification, which seems like, hey, maybe not the greatest time for that. I know that some experts that we spoke with today were shocked that Zelensky, in their view, wandered into this mess.
Remember, too, though, Hallie, this is a comedian. This guy was a comedian right up until the day he took office in this presidency. So for Ukrainians that we talked to, for our translators, for people who we know here on the ground, they said this was pretty clear And again, this was a problem for us. We weren't in touch with how the Ukrainians were communicating. This was our problem. He maybe shouldn't have been joking. It might have been tone deaf on his part, considering everything that was at stake, and there was a lot at stake. But, and again, we weren't the only network that did that, and I'm sure that networks throughout the world and journalists throughout the world were wondering this. He did say other things. He said that he had heard this before, and he was doing something that he's been doing for the past couple of weeks, which is kind of taking this tone, a little bit of mockery, a little bit of derision when it comes to Western media and Western intelligence assessments. And I'm not going to lie here, a lot of Ukrainians feel that way. They kind of have this sort of bitter, acidic wit when it comes to what they're hearing from the West, when their prognostications about whether or not there's going to be an invasion. They're frustrated with it, and they betray their frustration all the time. And that's what we were hearing today from Zelensky. We've been hearing that from other officials. They don't like being, and if you'll allow me to use this phrase, Hallie, they don't like being mansplained about Ukraine by non-Ukrainians. And that's something that we've been hearing from a lot of people. We have intelligence resources. We've got our military on the borders. We're Ukrainians. We're the leadership of Ukraine. Zelensky has basically said this before. I'm the president of Ukraine. Don't tell me about what the risks are, about what my public faces. And he said that again, basically again today. And that's why this whole thing about this unity march, this date, February 16th, day after tomorrow, he's making that into a day of national unity when you're going to be parading around wearing the national flag. He's saying, turn this into something else. Make this into something that just says, that the West can't tell us that this is the date of an invasion, and Moscow can't tell us to be afraid. There's a little bit of like a subtle, it's subtly telling everybody to go away.
Yeah, it's like
stop telling us.
It's a little bit of a middle
This-
finger. I think we can say that, right? Like a little bit of one.
Yeah. I can say that. I didn't know. Can we say that? We can say it's a middle finger.
You can say a lot of things, Matt. So here's the thing, that the posture and the messaging from the U.S. is different. Sure, but listen, the actions from the U.S. reflect a very different posture, at least from where we are, with the State Department still going ahead with pulling embassy operations, as you know, out of Kyiv, moving them further west, precautionarily, just to be safe, apparently.
Yeah, and they're moving them to, I believe they're moving them to Lviv, which is way out west. It was a city that used to be in Austria, essentially. So this is a city that actually looks totally different from the rest of Ukraine. And, this is out of an abundance of caution. We already started to see some U.S. diplomats move. And again, there's more than a dozen countries who are doing this. I think the U.S. is maybe taking an even harder line, it sounds like almost emptying out their embassy entirely. But, this is out of an abundance of caution. We're seeing pushback from the Ukrainian government about this. They don't love seeing diplomats doing this. They understand it. They might do the same with their diplomats in similar circumstances. But again, all of this is coming down to optics. They don't like the optics. They don't like seeing airlines canceling flights to Ukraine. That's actually causing, they don't like seeing Fitch downgrading ratings for bonds that are coming out of Ukraine. These things are actually literally costing the population money. So they're paying the price for a war that hasn't yet been waged. And that's really, a big topic, a real source of anger here.
Matt Bradley, live for us there in Ukraine. Matt, thank you. So right as we were coming on the air, the Canadian Prime Minister dropped a government grenade, so to speak, on those trucker protests we've been telling you about, announcing he's going to use the Emergencies Act in Canada, something we almost never see, to give his administration the power to break up those trucker demonstrations, which are heading into their third straight week in Ottawa. Here's Justin Trudeau.
With each illegal blockade, local law enforcement agencies have been acting to keep the peace within their jurisdiction. Despite their best efforts, it is now clear that there are serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law.
That bit of breaking news is coming as Ontario announces that people inside in public there don't need proof of vaccination anymore starting March 1st, which to some folks kind of sounded like a concession to the protesters. But leaders there say, no, that's not it. It's because the COVID numbers say it's safe now. And then in Windsor, that Ambassador Bridge you've been seeing is reopening today after this almost week-long border blockade started to really cripple the car industry. I want to bring in now Gabe Gutierrez. So, Gabe, let me start with what we just heard from Prime Minister Trudeau, not even in the last 20, 30 minutes or so, invoking this Emergencies Act because of these protests that are still happening in other Canadian cities. What kind of a difference is that going to make? What does that give the government the authority to do that they can't do now?
Hi there, Hallie. Well, yes, it is rarely used. It's a big deal because basically frustration has been mounting in Canada over the last several days and weeks, which, as you mentioned, these protesters have been kind of shutting the northern border between the U.S. northern border and, the Ambassador Bridge, the huge amount of commerce that it was prevented from coming over into the U.S. These emergency powers, Hallie, will give local police the ability to prohibit public assembly. More resources will be available to local law enforcement. And again, this is something that Prime Minister Trudeau says needs to be done in order to get these demonstrators under control. One thing you didn't mention, Hallie, and that also happened within the last 24 hours, is that in Western Canada, police have actually arrested 11 people and seized a lot of ammunition, body armor, weapons, suggesting that at least some of these demonstrators, again, not all, but at least some of these demonstrators may have been plotting some violence, Hallie.
You've also got, listen, you talked about the Ambassador Bridge, and Gabe, that's really important because as you say, this is a key lifeline for the Michigan economy, right? And the idea of trade across the border there. But there's still a police presence at the bridge. So it is open, but still being monitored? Like, how are we to think of this? Because this doesn't feel like it's totally over and done just yet.
Yeah, certainly not. And look, yes, the Ambassador Bridge may have reopened, but, my colleague Cal Perry was over in Canada over the last several days. He was also not just in Windsor, but in Ottawa, the capital city. Some of the demonstrators had just, basically sat there. And it doesn't take a lot in order to block these routes. All you need is several trucks, and you can really cause a lot of chaos by just preventing these trucks from going over the bridge. So certainly not over yet. And by the way, Hallie, there was this talk that some of these convoys may have tried to disrupt the Super Bowl. That obviously did not happen. Right. But in some of these communities, online communities, I should say, according to my colleague Ben Collins, who's taking a very close look at this, he says that these demonstrations, that these demonstrators, these convoys, might be now looking towards March 5th. As their next day of potentially disrupting roads across the U.S. Still remains to be seen whether it'll actually happen.
Well, not just in the U.S., not just in Canada, Gabe. We've seen this in countries all around the world. Belgium, Israel, France. And there's different ways that police are responding. You've got in Paris, police shooting off tear gas into these crowds of protesters. Then in New Zealand, they're taking a different tactic. They're playing the Macarena and Baby Shark and other, what some people might think of as annoying songs at very loud volumes to try to get people to leave. What seems to be working and what's not working?
Hallie, there's nothing annoying about the Macarena. I love the Macarena. I really do. I haven't heard it in a really long time, though. But yes, I could see being subjected to it over and over again might be very difficult. Look, this is something that is happening across the world. And again, my colleague Ben Collins says that, at least some of the fuel being poured on this is tied to disinformation that is actually coming from overseas and content mills in countries like Bangladesh and Romania. So anti-vaccine groups, apparently, according to my colleague Ben Collins' reporting, have really seized on this so-called movement. And these anti-vaccine groups and conspiracy theorists are taking the opportunity here and seeing, a possibility that they can gain, they can fly under the radar, not referring to themselves as, they won't be booted off of Facebook if they say that they are simply anti-vaccine. So this is really, as you said, happening across the world. Yeah. Big question on how much really, though, how many legs the movement does have and whether it will translate to actual protests here in the United States in the coming weeks, Hallie.
Gabe Gutierrez, great to see you on this story for us. Thank you for that reporting. Breaking right now, really in just the last couple minutes, we've got some news about the accounting firm for the Trump Organization, longtime accounting firm, now cutting ties with the organization and saying nearly 10 years worth of financial statements from the company can no longer be viewed as reliable. We're learning about this from a letter just made public by the New York Attorney General. She's been conducting this civil investigation into the former president's company. And literally, as I was talking to Gabe, as we've been on the air, we got a statement from the Trump Organization on this, basically saying, essentially, this doesn't really matter, saying in part, quote, their February 9th letter from Mazars, their now former accounting firm, confirms that after conducting a subsequent review of all prior statements of financial condition, Mazars' work was performed in accordance with all applicable accounting standards and principles. Here to translate that into English for us is NBC's Tom Winter, who's covering this. So, Tom, explain a couple things here. You've got Mazars, this accounting firm, essentially cutting ties with the Trump organization. Normally, we're not bringing you this as breaking news. We're not CNBC. That's not our jam. Here's why this is so interesting, is because this is happening against the backdrop of that investigation from the New York Attorney General. So explain why this is significant.
Right. And so this is a letter that was filed today, although it was sent to the Trump organization last week, Hallie. And essentially what it's saying is, hey, look, for 10 years, effectively, from June 2011 to 2020 in June, we provided you with a number of the statements of financial condition. So this would be if I was your accountant, Hallie, and that's probably not a good thing, but if I was your accountant, I would say, all right, send me your bank statement, send me your 401k, send me any stocks you might have, any sort of funds you may have overseas, what properties do you have, and I'll put together essentially a health check and say, look, this is how much Hallie owes to people, this is how much money Hallie has, and here's all the properties and assets, and this is why you may or may not feel comfortable lending to her and doing business with her. And what they've said is that the Trump organization can no longer rely on those statements. In the statement from the Trump organization, they're referring to the part of the letter where they say, look, while we have not concluded that the various financial statements as a whole contain material discrepancies, based upon the totality of the circumstances, we believe our advice to you is to no longer to rely on these statements. They say they've done that in part from the Attorney General, who you referenced, their civil investigation, their filings, Mazars' own internal investigation, and information that they've received both from within and outside of the company. So, and on top of that, they've got a conflict, they say, which is prohibiting them from continuing to represent and provide accounting for the Trump organization. So when you put it all together, effectively you're saying, look, you got to hire somebody new, and the information that we gave to you before, which is based on the information you gave us, we've now got some problems with it.
So the Trump organization seems to be saying, Tom, and again, I'm reading this like from my phone because it's coming in as we're on the air, seems to be saying, hey, this is kind of vindication for us. Is that spin from the Trump organization? Is that what they hope is happening here? Cut through some of that for us.
Yeah, that's what I would hope it would be if I were them. I think that when you look at this, it's probably the opposite. An accountant doesn't dream up the numbers. They rely on the numbers that are given to them. And based on this filing, it would seem that they can no longer stand up those numbers and provide their kind of seal of approval, Hallie. If they can't provide that seal of approval, that there's some sort of an issue with the underlying information that they received, I can understand how I would put out the statement that same way if I was the Trump organization. I don't know if investigators are going to look at it that way or are looking at it that way as they continue to comb through these docs.
Tom Winter, jumping in front of a camera for us on that. Tom, thank you.
Sure thing.
Today, in opening statements of the federal hate crimes trial for the 3 men who killed Ahmaud Arbery, prosecutors laid out how texts, how social media posts, and how witness testimony will prove, they say, that racism and hate played a role in the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. You remember back in February of 2020, Travis McMichael, his father Gregory McMichael, William Roddy Bryan, the 3 you see on your screen there, chased Arbery down a road. They told police they thought he was stealing in the neighborhood. Cell phone video showed some kind of a interaction, altercation, and then Travis McMichael shoots Arbery twice. This is the first time that McMichaels and Bryan, who, by the way, were already convicted of murder in state court in Georgia, they've already been sentenced to life in prison, but this time, in this trial, they're specifically accused of murdering him because of racial bias. Arbery's family has fought for this charge to be heard in court. 2 weeks ago, remember, the family made very clear their objections to a plea deal because they worried that the McMichaels would end up in a prison that wasn't what they wanted. Blaine Alexander joins us now from Atlanta. So, Blaine, we know that the opening statements wrapped up about 90 minutes ago. No cameras allowed inside. But can you bring us some of the highlights here? Because prosecutors were very clear and very specific in some of the language, the racist language that these 3 men have used in the past, they say.
They were very specific with that language. And this is really kind of what we've been wanting to find out for a few weeks now. We knew that it was going to show some sort of racist language, racial bias, according to the prosecutors. But today they really hit it on the nose. I want to read actually one of the more shocking passages that the prosecutor laid out. She says this came from Travis McMichael when he was speaking to a friend about a new job that he took. And I'm going to read a direct quote. She gave the direct quote today in court, essentially saying, zero expletives work with me. They ruin everything. That's why I love what I do, not an expletive in sight. And of course, the expletive is a derogatory term for a black person. So she kind of lays out the case that in social media posts and text messages, there have been either racist language or rants about black people that was used by the three defendants. And she says that gives kind of a window into their thinking, a window into their mindset, and why she says they made assumptions about Ahmaud Arbery when they saw him running down the street. That's what caused them to chase him down and ultimately kill him. Now, for their part, the defense attorneys in three separate opening statements all essentially said, listen, this is not good language. That can't be argued against, but it does not mean that their clients chased him down because he's black. They say that essentially he had been seen on video entering a house that was under construction in a neighborhood where there were burglaries. That's the reason they chased him down, because he was the man in the video in the house, not because he was a black man, Hallie.
So a couple more points to make here that I think are important. The jury makeup in the state trial was pretty controversial because it was a mostly white jury, 11 white people, 1 black juror in a location in a county that is majority black, right? That came up. Now you have a more diverse jury, but the fact that this is even to trial in the first place is interesting because there was a plea deal. Blaine, you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about the idea that there was maybe a plea deal in place. Ahmaud Arbery's family was adamant they did not want to see a plea deal. They wanted this federal hate crimes trial to happen.
Absolutely. So not only was there a plea deal, Travis McMichael actually went in front of a judge in open court and pleaded guilty to this and then withdrew that plea, that guilty plea, a few days later. Greg McMichael certainly signaled that he was getting ready to do so. So, you know, this is not something that can be used in court. It's not something that the jury can consider. And during this jury selection process, the judge asked a number of questions to essentially make sure that the jurors or the potential jurors didn't have any sort of knowledge of previous coverage or hadn't necessarily been watching the case, really tried to get those who had a clean slate, who didn't know about the conversations that you and I were having, about the coverage that we've been having, that the intentions were for them to plead guilty. So they tried their best to kind of get a clean slate with the jury. But let's talk about that racial breakdown, because you're absolutely right. More diverse. The breakdown is as follows. We've got 8 white jurors, 3 black jurors, and 1 Hispanic juror in a jury of 12. And then, of course, 4 alternates, one of whom is a Pacific Islander. So certainly more diverse. I think the other piece of it, too, is that they're not all from Brunswick. This is a much wider net. We're talking about the entire southern district of Georgia. So we're talking about people from as far as 4 hours away in this very large state of Georgia. So some geographical diversity as well when it comes to this jury pool, Hallie.
Blaine Alexander reporting for us on this. Blaine, I'm sure we'll talk again over the next couple of weeks. Appreciate you being there. Right now, a judge in a D.C. court is currently deciding whether to keep New York couple Ilya Lichtenstein and Heather Morgan in prison behind bars in jail or not. And here's why. These are the two who allegedly conspired to launder something like $4 billion in stolen Bitcoin. Prosecutors say they found $40,000 in U.S. and foreign currency. They found more than 50 electronic devices and Bitcoin wallets. They found hollowed out books and a bag marked burner phone on it when they went to go search the house. Lichtenstein's a Russian tech founder and, quote, occasional magician. Morgan's a streetwear designer and a rapper who goes by Razzle Khan. And when the feds were getting ready to search their apartment and find all this stuff, the couple said they'd leave, but they said they wanted their cat. Apparently, they said the cat was under the bed, but as Morgan called for it, she grabbed her phone instead to hit the lock button. Agents had to get it from her. Prosecutors say that's going to make it harder to go through the phone. No further information on the cat, but if their story sounds like a show you'd watch, you're in luck. Netflix already has a series on them in the works. Jake Ward is joining me now. So, Jake, there is a lot to this one, right? Let me start with this hearing in D.C. where this couple, I believe, pledged millions of dollars, put up their parents' homes even to try to get released. Do we know what the deal is? Is that still going on?
We still don't know, Hallie, at this hour whether these two will be released. The government has argued that they should not be, and so their fate is still unknown. This is still just a bail hearing. We also don't know what plea they're going to enter, but Wow, as you read the list of, as you rattled off the facts of the case in the beginning of it, I mean, it just reminds us just how much is going on here. It is a dazzling assortment of plot twists. This couple, a 34-year-old and 31-year-old, had been very much on the scene in the crypto world, out there as a rapper. His crypto company was, in theory, aimed at, quote, fraud and terrorism, fighting against fraud and terrorism. And then here they both are now charged by the DOJ with what wound up being the greatest seizure in the history of that department. $3.6 billion of an alleged over $4 billion caught up in this scheme. They, were part of this thing, the Bitfinex hack, which back in 2016 amounted to about $70 million worth of Bitcoin being stolen. At that time, it was such a huge amount of money, it actually dinged the value of Bitcoin by about 20%. But now, Assistant Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco saying that the amount of money has now risen to $4.5 billion. The idea that these two may have been sitting on several $billion worth of Bitcoin, pretty incredible. And all these facts that you've laid out here make this really a memorable case, in addition to being such an enormous one, Hallie.
Yeah, it's sort of dramatic, but it's also really significant in that it's being, that they're being held accountable for this, alleged crime again. But the idea that there was this national crypto enforcement team that was created last year, and now you're seeing some of the results of that. And what it says that law enforcement is being really serious about going after crypto crime.
It is interesting to see, how far we have come. Crypto has always had this reputation as being sort of the perfect vehicle for money laundering because it was, in theory, untraceable. But the thing that you forget is that actually people who know what they're doing with crypto understand the blockchain, which is basically a huge public transparent ledger, one big receipt where every transaction is recorded. Well, it turns out the government is getting better at reading those transactions. And in this vast investigation of this too, managed to find that they were in fact sitting on the unique password that led to this money, in spite of the fact that they'd been moving that money around. You also mentioned some of the physical things that were found in their apartment. In their digital files, they also found folders marked personas and logins for various services that allowed you to buy fake IDs and passports. So all kinds of incredible stuff being found there. And it really speaks to the sophistication of law enforcement when it comes to the crypto world, which, up until now had been pretty lacking, Hallie.
Yeah, and with so much attention on crypto, Jake, we saw those Super Bowl commercials last night about it. You have to think there will continue to be a spotlight on this. Jake Ward, great reporting. We'll look for more from you coming up on NBC Nightly News. Appreciate it. When we get back, the controversial posts that some say are glamorizing a journey across the Mediterranean that thousands of migrants die on every year. The reality behind those images and the influence they're having on people back home, straight ahead. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a federal judge in New York City says he will dismiss Sarah Palin's defamation suit against the New York Times. Why? The judge disagreed with Palin's claim a Times editorial damaged her reputation. Reuters reports the judge will still let the jury finish its deliberations. Remember, Palin sued the paper after it published an editorial incorrectly linking her to a 2011 mass shooting in Arizona that nearly killed former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. Number 2, Senator Ben Ray Lujan says he will be back at work in, quote, a few short weeks after a stroke late last month. He says he's on the road to recovery and plans to be back at the Capitol in time for a vote on a Supreme Court nominee. Number 3, American Airlines says a flight from L.A. to D.C. here had to be diverted to Kansas City Sunday because of bad behavior by a passenger. A federal criminal complaint filed today says a man had to be subdued by some passengers and flight attendants when he apparently tried to open the exit door. He's in custody pending a detention hearing, which has not yet been scheduled. Number 4, the U.S. government is suspending all imports of avocados from Mexico after a plant safety inspector there got a threat over his cell phone. The suspension's in place until further notice. Luckily for exporters, this happened after Super Bowl orders were already placed. Number 5, a big player in the world of NFTs has stopped most transactions in the marketplace. Cent says that's because they're trying to figure out how to deal with people selling NFTs that don't belong to them. Last year, you might remember Cent famously sold an NFT of Jack Dorsey's first tweet for nearly $3 million. Also tonight, 2 Tunisian women are facing some big backlash for the way that they're portraying this risky journey across the Mediterranean that leaves thousands of people dead every year. In the last few months, these women have posted videos of themselves alongside other migrants as they left on a boat from Tunisia to Europe. You can see them here. There's sunsets. They're singing along to a rap song. They're posing for pictures. They're waving. Some critics are saying they're normalizing or maybe even glamorizing this trip. And they have a pretty big audience. Between the two of them, they have nearly 2 million followers on TikTok and Instagram. Tunisia is one of the main points of departure for migrants setting off from North Africa to Europe, and it can be a dangerous trip. The Missing Migrants Project says more than 2,000 people went missing in the Mediterranean just last year alone, just in 2021. 23,000 have been missing since 2014. Claudio Lavagna joins me now to talk about this. Claudio, can you talk a little bit, first of all, about this kind of trip and the criticism that these women are getting from this social media sort of idealized look at what this journey is like in their view versus the reality?
Hey, Hallie. Well, yes, I mean, it is very different than the actual reality in the sense that until now, what we know about this trip is that they are definitely very dangerous. They are very often deadly trips where migrants lose their lives, they drown, or they are rescued at the last minute in the very dangerous waters of the Mediterranean Sea. What we've seen so far, thanks to things like the mobile phone from migrants taking these trips, is scenes of desperation, overcrowded dinghies with people in real trouble. And suddenly we see images, as you say and as you showed, of young migrants, you can call them that, of course, taking pictures of themselves as if they're taking a leisurely cruise. Why is that dangerous? Because that sends the wrong message to the hundreds of thousands of followers in Tunisia who may think that it's just, you know, a walk in the park or a little swim to Europe and Italy, and may just want to emulate them as they appear to want, they say, when they comment on their posts. And this is extremely dangerous because it is so far from the actual reality, Hallie. And the reality here is that many, and we're talking about thousands of migrants, lose their lives every single year trying that very dangerous crossing to Italy and therefore to Europe, Hallie.
So we've talked about the backlash. There are some people who are trying to support these women too, basically saying this shows like just how few options people have. Explain that piece.
Well, I tried to translate a few comments from the actual posts that these two women posted from Tunisian Arabic into English, and many of them, I must say, are very positive and even supportive of them. Some say, and I'm reading this, "I'm proud of you, you made it, congratulations. I hope I will follow your example." And that's exactly what I was talking about earlier on. While there are, of course, the institutions, the authorities who are warning, who are spending many years trying to warn migrants trying to leave from North Africa, and I'm talking about Tunisia, but also Libya, into warning them that this is a very dangerous trip. Well, this may ruin basically many years of a campaign of information that tries to dissuade them from doing that. So on one side you have the authorities trying to say, please don't do that because it's dangerous. And on the other side you have people following these women or girls and migrants and saying, well, you know, you've made it, then I can make it too.
Give me the context check here, Claudio. Explain the conditions that are driving people to leave Tunisia and try to seek better lives.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, Hallie, Tunisia is one of the ports and points of departure for obvious geographical reasons. Well, Tunisia as well as Libya and Egypt are, you know, the northern countries in Africa, and it is a fairly short stretch, a fairly short crossing of the Mediterranean to Lampedusa, which is the southern island in Italy, and therefore the southern point to reach Europe. But it is a very, very dangerous crossing, and many people, as I said earlier, lose their lives. But recently, Tunisia has not been the main port of departure. Libya was. Recently, in the last couple of years, Tunisia has gone back to becoming a point of departure because after several years of economic stability, stability, government stability. Now you have an 18% unemployment rate, which is pushing people trying to do that dangerous and often deadly crossing, Hallie.
Claudio Lavagna live for us from Italy on that. Claudio, thank you. Coming up, a plan to make the Postal Service faster could end up delayed for weeks, and you might be surprised by what the holdup is. Plus, Facebook's in a new fight over its facial recognition practices, why Texas is looking for hundreds of billions of dollars over it when we come back. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our West Coast Bureau, police in Albuquerque, New Mexico, have arrested a man they suspect of stabbing 11 people Sunday. This suspect was reported to be riding a BMX-style bike and to have stabbed people with a big knife. Police say they think the attacks were random. All of the victims, fortunately, appear to be in stable condition. We're learning from our Southeast Bureau that one person has been found dead after a small plane crashed off the coast of North Carolina. Police say they're still working on finding the 7 other people who were on board the single-engine plane near Drum Inlet Sunday. There's no indication anybody on board survived. Also from our Southeast Bureau, it's the first day of early voting in Texas for the state's primaries in March. And a new poll from the University of Texas and the Texas Project has given us a snapshot of how voters feel ahead of those primaries. President Biden's approval rating in that state stands at 36%. Governor Greg Abbott, Attorney General Ken Paxton are polling well over their opponents. So, look, today was supposed to be a, decent day for bipartisanship on Capitol Hill. Not a sentence we say around here often. But that's because you had both parties really getting behind this big vote on a bill to get the post office some much-needed help. But now it's under threat because of a technical error. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is pushing to fix that little technical issue tonight so that the Senate can confirm a bill that would give a lifeline to the U.S. Postal Service. This thing's already passed the House by a big margin, 342 to 94. We don't see margins like that all the time. But Democrats say Republican Senator Rick Scott may still stall efforts to make that quick technical tweak. And if that happens, the bill could be pushed back weeks. Any delay could be expensive for the Postal Service and slow down what would be a bipartisan win for this Congress. Here's why the bill is so important.
We all depend on the Postal Service. We need it.
The pandemic illustrating that more than ever, with millions relying on the mail for everything from food to ballots. But with COVID came delays and growing frustration. And for the Postal Service, signs of trouble with calls from Republicans to privatize it and the agency reporting a nearly $5 billion loss in 2021. That's partly because the USPS doesn't get any taxpayer money.
All the money that runs the post office comes from your purchase of stamps.
Now, rare bipartisan agreement that it's got to get fixed.
The bill is passed. This targeted bill addresses the immediate needs of the Postal Service to help it succeed into the 21st century.
So what's the ask? $57 billion to make a better postal service. Some benefits, a website to track your deliveries, 6 days a week of service guaranteed, help for rural areas, a boost to local news by expanding special rates for paper delivery, and money for new delivery trucks. Retired employees won't get money up front for health benefits anymore, and many will have to enroll in Medicare. But lawmakers think these changes can save the agency $50 billion over 10 years. The bill even uses part of a plan proposed by Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. Democrats have slammed the Republican donor for cutting overtime, cutting back on post office hours, and slashing delivery times for first-class mail. But on this, they agree, with DeJoy praising the bill last week, calling it vital to the U.S. Postal Service and the American people. But keep in mind, the clock is ticking here. The Senate goes on recess for President's Day, meaning it could be weeks before they can hold a vote if they can't get it done ASAP. Another headline tonight, Texas is throwing a big lawsuit at Meta, the parent company of Facebook, over their facial recognition program. Here's the deal. That program was actually stopped last November. But the claim from Texas is that Meta violated privacy laws by, quote, repeatedly collecting and commercializing users' biometric data without their explicit consent for years. And then Texas says Meta failed to destroy the data in a reasonable period of time. All of this, of course, before Meta stopped doing this whole thing. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton says the penalties against Meta could be billions and billions of dollars. No response, no comment yet from Meta on this lawsuit. But I want to bring in Ben Collins to talk to us about this. And Ben, talk to me about this piece of it. Meta ended the program, right? The program's over. There's no more facial recognition stuff. But Texas, correct me if I'm wrong, Texas is basically saying, we're worried about what you're doing with all that biometric data. Is that where the tension point comes in here?
Yeah, that's basically it. Look, this ended in November of 2021. They've actually held on to a lot of the data because they had to produce it for this specific thing with Texas. So that's kind of the interesting part here. What we're looking at specifically is you're on Facebook. You see a little, you used to, until 2021, you used to see a square over your face saying, hey, are you in this photo? Is that you? That's biometric data. There you go. You see it right there. That's biometric data. That basically says Facebook has recognized you based on your facial features and is trying to tag you in other stuff. The worry, privacy-wise, is that means they have basically a file on you and where you are and where you've been going. They've been doing this since 2010, so Texas really wants to put an end to it.
What's interesting here is that this lawsuit has some similar pieces to it from a class action suit from 2015 in Illinois, and Facebook ended up settling that for like $600+ million. What's the difference here? Why is this coming up now in 2022 again?
Well, in Texas, it has to come from the AG. It's a kind of a different story here, and it could be a lot more money. They're setting these criminal penalties, $25,000 per person, plus $10,000 for some other stuff per person. So when they say, billions of dollars, they mean billions of dollars. That's the starting point here. Look, this is a very big populist thing. There's nobody who is out there defending Facebook and their use of facial recognition right now. They are sort of a pariah in the tech space. It's a pretty easy win for an AG that is under investigation right now by the FBI too. So like there's a lot of things going on here politically that make this a lot more complicated than just suing Facebook. You mentioned some pieces of the political onion that you've started to peel back, but there's another piece of this, which is the absence of federal privacy protection laws, right? We hear a lot, I live in Washington, I cover what happens with, Congress and the White House, et cetera. A lot of talk about trying to do more on that front. So far, not a ton of action. It's up to the states now, like Texas, to sort of piecemeal pass some of these kinds of things. Texas has this privacy protection law. Dozens of other states have similar laws. But it feels like this is also an illustration and an example of the sort of federal versus state piece to this, too. Yeah, it's like in Europe, they have this thing called Gdpr, which is pretty comprehensive, maybe overwrought, actually, in terms of data collection. And it really limits what companies can take from people from their cookies, basically, on the internet. So it prevents people from being tracked. We don't have that federally here. We don't have anything even kind of like that. The internet is a wild west in terms of any sort of federal protection right now. So you get things from California, you get things from Texas, you get these piecemeal things that, they're hoping that if the state is big enough that they'll just have to institute it nationwide. That's what Meta's been fighting against all this time. That's why when they say that they want regulation, when Facebook says, hey, no, we want to come to the table and we want to figure out what the rules are here, they really do mean it. But they don't mean it in the sense that they want to, shell out billions of dollars to Texas. Ben Collins, thank you for bringing us that. Appreciate it. Coming up, some people have been calling last night's Super Bowl halftime show the best one yet, but it's not just the music that has people talking. What we know about what the NFL knew before the performance about this moment you're looking at. Stay close. So while the NFL is facing down a class action lawsuit over questions about discrimination in hiring, the Super Bowl took a timeout during halftime to make diversity a big part of the show. You saw it. I bet you watched it. The halftime show going hip-hop, really, for the first time. But along with the celebration, it looked like some of the stars were taking a moment to take a stand against racism, like the moment we're about to show you, Eminem taking a knee after his performance. There was some initial reporting that maybe he was making this move in defiance of the NFL, but it was actually apparently approved by them. Let's bring in Jem Aswad, the senior music editor at Variety, to talk more about this. Jem, it's great to have you with us. So let me start with that Eminem taking a knee moment here, right? The NFL came out afterwards and said, no, we didn't prevent Eminem from doing that. Players and coaches could take a knee. Any of the performers could take a knee too, right?
That's what they said. But then again, that's what they would say after it happened. Word was, and there were some reliable reports about this, that a lot of the lyrics for a lot of the songs were considered inappropriate, as was taking a knee. But Eminem did it anyway.
the overall backdrop of this, right? And we mentioned it coming into this segment, the Brian Flores lawsuit. We've talked about it here on this show, these accusations of systemic racism in hiring that Flores is making, the former Miami Dolphins head coach. You also have juxtaposed that with what we saw in this halftime show. And as the New York Times is writing, the league is so powerful in this op-ed, it can basically steamroll any controversy. Tell me how you saw this halftime show in relation to what the NFL is facing off the field.
Well, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. As a show, it was a fantastic show. It was, it was a great medley of semi-old school hip-hop hits. Most of them were 20 or 30 years old, but bullseye for the demographic, great performance for all of them. What it really brings up, though, is Roc Nation, Jay-Z's company. It is the official entertainment consultant for the NFL. And the NFL has used it to change the narrative because the NFL has so many horrible things against it. There's sexual discrimination lawsuits. There's racial discrimination lawsuits. There's brain damage to veteran football players. There's the entire Colin Kaepernick scandal where he is still not playing 5 years later. That's an awful lot, but they just kind of brush it off. And, here they are. They're just like, oh, look, Eminem took a knee. Problem solved. It's not.
It's a great, Jem, it's an important point to make. It's an important thing to talk about. Can I ask you, music is your business. This is something that you report on every day. What stood out to you last night, right? Was it those moments that we're talking about? Was it something else? What did you feel had the most impact on a bigger level from this performance?
Well, taking a knee was the thing that everybody was talking about. And that actually works to the NFL's advantage because it shows, oh, geez, somebody took a stand on the big stage, and that's okay with us. We're self-aware. But, that was really just one moment. The larger backdrop was a celebration of Los Angeles and, frankly, a celebration of Dr. Dre. He clearly was in the driver's seat of the whole thing. And almost every song that was performed, no matter who was singing or rapping on it, Dre either produced, co-wrote, or essentially sponsored the artist, which he did with just about all of them. Not, he didn't sponsor Mary J. Blige, but he produced the song, the main song that she played. And Anderson .Paak, who was sort of seventh on the bill, the great drummer you saw, he's a Dr. Dre protege as well. So it was Dr. Dre's love letter to LA and to himself.
And to Compton specifically, too. Jem, thank you so much. I so appreciate you being with us to talk through that. That does it for this hour for us. We're going to have a whole lot for you here more tomorrow. Same time, same place.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.